Boa tarde, pessoal. Está começando aqui mais uma edição do Café Pesquisa. Hoje o tema Impasses do capitalismo, discutindo a questão monetária, moeda. E o primeiro trabalho é da professora Bárbara Fritz, que é Moeda Comum do Mercosur, os BRICS, Teoria da Moeda Ótima e o Sistema de Pagamentos em Moeda Local. O segundo tema será apresentado aí pelo professor da Federal de Goiás, o Felipe Nogueira, Dólar e comércio na periferia, uma visão keynesiana-estruturalista e a experiência do sistema de pagamentos em moeda local entre Argentina e Brasil. E o terceiro trabalho, apresentado pelo professor Christoph, The Politics of Regulation Crypto Assets. E a gente vai, então, dar prosseguimento aqui. Por gentileza, professora Bárbara, iniciar os trabalhos. Obrigado.
Muito obrigada, Fábio, pela introdução. Muito obrigada pelo convite, Bruno, Ana Rosa e todos os envolvidos. Estou muito feliz de estar de volta aqui na Unicamp, que faz tempo, pandemia e tudo, que eu tive aqui, mas já tive várias relações intensas e de longa data com a Unicamp, por isso estou tão feliz. Now I will switch to English for the presentation because Christoph is more fluent in English than in Portuguese. But please, in the discussion, feel free to do the questions in Portuguese also, if you feel better with that. I'm all happy with that. Okay. So, as Fabio said, this is the title. It's a long title. And I will explain you why I will talk about all these issues. We know in the beginning of the year, Lula and the Argentinian President Fernandez, in their first meeting after Lula's election, they met and said, we will create a common currency of the Mercosur. And they argued that it was important to re-engage into Mercosur integration because this was a key strategy to re-industrialize the two countries. The second event was the BRICS meeting in the midst of this year, where Lula said, I'm spending the whole day not to understand why we still use the US dollar in doing trade with our partners, our beloved partners within BRICS. Let's create a common currency. So two big events calling for a common currency with other countries. Of course, we know that since last Sunday that progress in Mercosur integration will not happen so soon. So this is not a current issue since 2 days, 3 days ago, but still, let's discuss it. What was the idea to understand it better? For the BRICS currency, the argument of Lula and others was not reindustrialization, but to decrease dependency of the US dollar, and by this decrease vulnerability to global shocks, global financial shocks, and to decrease dependency also of sanctions attached to the US dollar. So different motives for the two different cases. For the case of the idea of the common currency for the Mercosur, famous, not so orthodox economists as Olivier Blanchard and Paul Krugman went out in Twitter or X and said, this is insane. This is absolutely crazy. This is, Paul Krugman said, a nice opportunity to come back to the theory of optimum currency areas, and we can tell from that it makes no sense. So let's go to these theories and see how they work and if they really can apply to the cases. I will first talk about this very briefly about the optimum currency area theories and adjust them to the global south, which I think is very necessary. Second, and probably I'll skip that for the sake of time, maybe I talk quickly about the ideas of Albert O. Hirschman and his ideas of productive incoherence, which are quite interesting to apply to this case of the Sistema de Pagamentos Moeda Local, the regional payment system in local currency. And before I go into that case study, I will talk briefly about what is South-South monetary cooperation, what can be done there, what are the forms and institutional arrangements, and then I will conclude. Okay, So first, optimum currency area theory. Quick lesson here in theory. Freshening up. Probably you know the concept. So there was a first generation of theory building, very much started by Mundell, Nobel Prize winner in economics, already in the 60s. And his idea was that for two countries or more countries or a region, a geographic area, to have a common currency, it is important that they have synchronized business cycles, that their cycles are similar. And he argued this in the 70s, 60s on the basis of their production structure. If countries are very different or regions in terms of their production structure, they need different monetary policies. If they are more similar, it makes sense to join into one currency. There was lots of theory building since the 60s because this turned a hot topic. So McKinnon argued that not only the synchronization in terms of the rhythm of the economy is always important, but also trade opens. And Keenan later added to that trade diversification was important. Not that one economy would depend on one specific product and the other one on one specific product, and shocks related to one product would influence very much, but asymmetrically. So diversification would limit the effects of specific product-related shocks. And then this is very linked to the process of European monetary integration. Came the idea of a sequencing. Again, McKinnon here famous in that, similar to the sequencing of financial liberalization he brought up. So his idea of the sequencing was that, okay, if countries want to go towards a single currency, a regional currency, a common currency, first let's harmonize trade and liberalize trade. Then second, let's join and harmonize capital markets and financial markets. Third, let's create a common currency. And fourth, let's go towards political integration, because then the fiscal side also is included. And we see even the euro did not go to the full end. But that would be the idea. Start with trade, end with political unification. So from this view, let's look on trade integration levels of different regions of the world. And you see here up there, this is Europe, the European Union. So, okay, there's a good case for trade-based monetary unification. The second one is US, Mexico, and Canada. Would also be a case for a common currency. They're not going to that. Mercosur is the red one down there. So, would be no case for a common currency. First on this sequential approach of trade first and then later others. Would not make sense. And that's why Krugman is arguing against the common currency in the Mercosur. No harmonization, not even far by a sufficient trade integration level. And I don't have the data for the BRICS. Bruno has them, certainly. It might be intermediate, but there's another issue. Here I first go into the case of the Mercosur, because I'm looking on the two cases. Let's look first on the case for the Mercosur. There's not very big, but rather clear literature that shows that intra-regional South-South integration has usually, when it's regional, a different nature, a different quality. There's some literature both on Latin America and on Africa that shows that the level of technology, the technological content of intra-regional trade is much higher than in global trade. And if we look on the case of Brazil within Mercosur, this is very clear. While Brazil is predominantly exporting commodities to the rest of the world, to Argentina, it is exporting the predominantly middle and up high-tech goods. So this would be an argument to use regional integration for pushing towards industrialization. And two PhD students of mine have done a recent paper where they show that intra-regional trade is less affected by Dutch disease effects, by the volatility of commodity prices and its negative effects on other production. Because if the countries suffer similar trade shocks from commodities, then if commodity prices go up, they have they at the same time have higher demand for the high-tech products from the partnering country, which is a very interesting argument, I find. But there's a problem of indigeneity. This intra-regional trade only can increase, and we see the low levels of most South-South integration. It is very low. It only can increase if we don't have permanent and repeated exchange rate shocks there. So it needs some exchange rate stability for investors and firms really addressing intra-regional trade with a more stable perspective for their profits. And we know from the case of Mercosur, but we also know this from a general literature, that as long as countries follow their, especially countries from the global south, with recurrent balance of payment problems, as long as they have to use the exchange rate as a means of adjustment, they will do towards their neighbors a beggar thy neighbor policy, which is very negative for regional trade. And this might be well the case to explain why Mercosur intra-regional trade levels are so low. But the BRICS case is different. In the BRICS case, Bruno, you may correct me. Bruno is the expert. We have a very asymmetric trade patterns, which is very similar to North-South trade patterns. It is China exporting manufactured high-tech goods towards all other members of the BRICS countries. And all the others are exporting towards China commodities and have rather little trade amongst them. So the argument is not the same. Okay, and we have a second generation of OCA, optimum currency area trade theory, optimum currency area theory, which goes against this trade first argument. This was theory which was built in the years before the euro introduction. And in the first years, they said there's an endogenous effect of creating a common currency, which then increases into intra-regional trade integration, because the same stable exchange rate and the same currency takes away many hurdles for trade. So we do not necessarily wait until we have very high trade integration to have effects of a monetary currency. And from this appears a bit in the second generation theory, but it appears more in literature related to countries of the global south. Monetary integration or financial integration in its more complex dimensions can cushion against global monetary and financial shocks, and also other kinds of shocks. If countries can isolate themselves a bit amongst them, within them, against global shocks, this can have very positive effects. And this might be the argument more relevant for the BRICS. Okay, how am I with time? I think I skipped the Hirschman thing. You can ask me later, and go for the typology of South-South regional monetary cooperation. So there are different types of South-South monetary and financial cooperation. Of course, a very well-known example are multilateral development banks, as the CAF in Latin America, as the BRICS Bank, as others, which provide finance for large and cross-border investment, etc. There are regional monetary funds where countries with their partners do pool part of their foreign exchange reserves and do lend them to the country when this is in need. So it depends not only on the IMF in case of a financial crisis, but can also address this other source, like the Fondo Latinoamericano de Reservas, which is very small, but very important for smaller member countries, or the ASEAN arrangement, and others. And third, and this is what I will be talking about, it's regional payment systems, which use local currencies of the member countries for intra-regional trade instead of the US dollar. Okay. And they can foster regional trade and can, to a certain degree, when they are designed in a very specific manner, also a bit from financial shocks, from global financial shocks. Okay, what do we have in terms of regional payment systems? We have first the mother of all regional payment systems, which was the European Payment Union. A rather big scheme, very important for Western European trade integration in the post-World War. We have some small mechanisms like the Asian Clearing Union or two African initiatives which are in state of planning. And we have in Latin America several initiatives. Hey, they overlap, but that's not the point, which is rather a long-standing arrangement, ALADI, which was created in the 70s and included almost all South American member countries and had high relevance in the debt crisis in the 1980s. Then it lost importance. We have the Sucre, which has been the agreement amongst the Venezuela, Cuba, Ecuador, Bolivia, etc. Countries, the leftist alliance under Chavez. And we have the SML, Sistema de Pagamentos and Moeda Local, which is the Mercosur. And I will come back at a later moment to these two, because they are an important reference for the SML. How does a regional payment system work? I already saw nodding faces, heads, but let's explain it very quickly. Let's take the case of a Brazilian firm exporting to Argentina. Without the regional payment system, what is the common practice? The Brazilian exporter emits a note in dollar as a bill, sends this to the Argentinian importer, sends the products, and the Argentinian importer has to find dollars. He has to switch from Argentinian peso to find dollars to pay the Brazilian exporter in dollars, and the Brazilian exporter, because he's doing his business in reais, in national currency, has to switch back to reais. So we have several steps of switches between currencies, which create transaction costs and can cause problems when there is a lack of US dollars, when there's a liquidity problem in US dollars or sanctions or whatever. What a regional payment system does, and there are different forms. Now here explain the most simple form, which is also the case of the SML. It allows the Brazilian exporter on a voluntary basis in this case, to emit the note, the bill in reais. The Argentinian importer pays the bill in pesos, but there is an agreement between the Central Bank of Argentina and Brazil that nets all trade operations through this mechanism at the end of day and only settles the difference between the imports from Brazil and the imports from Argentina as a net difference in the case of the SML in US dollars. And all other actors involved remain in their own currency, because the central banks do the equilibration and do the settling of the difference in dollar. So our Brazilian exporter and our Argentinian importer can stay with their own currencies and don't have the hurdle to go towards the dollar and backwards. Okay. Now to the case of the SML. It is a mechanism which has been created within the realm of the Mercosur in 2008. And here I have the data for as a voluntary mechanism. So exporters and importers in the member countries can use the mechanism, but they do not need to use it. And what we have here, we see at the left side the total volume, quick increase in terms of the volume traded through the mechanism, and then somehow a stabilization. Okay, but if we look at the relative amounts, we see that it's a very small share. It only 5 to 7% of Brazilian trade with Argentina goes through the SML. And Brazil's trade with Argentina is not more than 10%, in good times, sometimes 15%. So you see it's 5 to 10% of 10 to 15%. It's very small. But what is going through this mechanism in terms of products is car parts, textiles, leather, pharmaceutical products, etc. So the very non-standard export products of Brazil. So the mechanism is very, very small. And it's not so different with the other countries. But still, we argue in the paper, which I didn't tell in the beginning. It's based on a paper together with Nina Kaltenbrunner, Bianca Orsi, and Larissa Mühlich. So this is not only my work, it's also their work. And then I did a small note on the case of the common currency of the Mercosur. You have both links in the invitation to the seminar. Okay, so we argue, that's why I say we, that still, despite its very diminished scale, it is a success story, because it is the first case and the only case of central bank cooperation in the Mercosur. Before there was nothing, and there's nothing beyond that. And the very nice thing of doing this paper together is that we did it based on interview, not only on literature review, and there's very little literature on the case, and on analysis of data available at central banks, etc. But we also did interviews with central bankers in Brazil, in Argentina, and Uruguay. And this was great. It was so much fun, and we learned so much of them. So all the central bankers involved in that mechanism and in the building of that mechanism told us that for them it was an incredible process of building confidence amongst themselves, amongst the central bankers, to learn how the others worked, what was ours, the technical way of doing, but also of elaborating on rules and procedures together and to stick to them. And that's also what the literature tells, that regional payment systems are rather simple mechanisms, but they can be the building ground for further cooperation. And in midst of an agonizing Mercosur in the 2010s, which had many steps backward, many processes stagnating or even going backwards, many conflicts, this mechanism has been steadily growing and expanding in terms of institutional mechanisms. It's based on bilateral agreements. This Mercosur payment system, it's not something which the Mercosur does, but it's based on bilateral agreements between the central banks of the core Mercosur members. So it started first with an agreement, and then the activating of this agreement between Argentina and Brazil in 2008. In 2014, Uruguay joined, first with Brazil, then later with Argentina, and it took until 2018 that Paraguay was included and made an agreement with all other member countries. So it went on over all this agonizing period, which we find very, very impressive. And the interviewees told us that it was very important that this mechanism was so simple and so diminutive, because it only by this way could survive this turbulent period. If it would have been very big and very outspoken and very visible, it would not have been survived. But as it has been such a simple technical mechanism, where the central bankers ensured that there was no cost and no risk involved for the central banks, because they, at the end of every day, they would net their transactions, it could go on. And the aim was not to do big things, but just to reduce transaction costs, especially for small and medium firms, which usually do not go to the foreign exchange market and usually do not export, to make them their life easier, to have easy access to exporting to Mercosur countries. And if you look from that perspective, it's not such a diminutive mechanism, because the share of SMEs in Mercosur trade is not much bigger than the share the SME really is covering in terms of inter-regional trade. So this already shifts a bit the bar of what is a success or not. But there are limitations, of course. It's not only the absolute size, but also, and this was something we could only understand when we did the interviews, it's highly asymmetric in its use, especially in the big chunk of trade between Argentina and Brazil. For these countries, 98% of all operations are Brazilian exports to Argentina, not the other way around. And what the central bankers in Argentina and Brazil explained to us that the motivation for the Brazilian central bankers was to ease the life of Brazilian small and medium enterprises, because in Brazil, until recently, I think until last year, there was a complex bureaucratic procedure necessary to access the foreign exchange market in terms of a carta de comércio de câmbio, costly thing to do. For big firms, they were doing it as a routine. For small firms, would be have been very heavy in terms of administrative costs, transaction costs, and they could circumvent this by using the SML. While on the other side, for Argentinian exporters, it was not very attractive to use the mechanism because they were keen in earning US dollar and not peso, because inflation, unstable exchange rate, parallel exchange rate markets, capital controls, etc. So for them, the incentive was to, if I export, I want to get my US dollars, and we don't want to get pesos. So why should I use the SML? And this is something you only learn when you dig very deep into such a mechanism. And it was constructed also so small and so simple and with this no cost, no risk perspective to central banks, because they were the two competing or the other ways of doing payment systems, regional payment systems in Latin America was the ALADI, which kind of died out in the 90s and 2000s. I did some work with André Martarello on that at UNCTAD. It got a mechanism which came with insurance, so the central banks would incur the risk for operations which would not be fulfilled between the trade partners. And Sucre was a highly politicized mechanism, which never worked well and came along with all ideas of substituting dollars. So they wanted to get very distant from the Sucre. That's why they kept it so simple, so technical. But the firms, there was a survey, were very satisfied, and the firms starting to use the mechanism used it again and again. So it works okay, but the macroeconomic effects are quite limited. Okay, and our last point, the idea that regional payment systems should serve as a starting point for further cooperation and integration did not come through in the case of the SML. There were, for example, negotiations for a swap arrangement, which is a credit line, standing credit line between two central banks, between Argentina and Brazil in 2009, again in 2014. They were already almost done with the negotiations, but then China came and offered much bigger swaps, and then the idea was done. And Argentina renewed the swap also in 2020 and used it even to pay the IMF off this year. So nothing more came out in terms of institution building. Okay, so I come to the end. In theory, both projects of a common currency have the idea of reindustrialization, respectively, of shielding economies from global vulnerabilities, etc. And in theory, they can provide higher resilience against shocks. For example, for a mechanism like the SML, if there's a shortage in US dollars, this can shield regional trade in the Mercosur from this, with shielding it even more if there would be a credit time for the membrane countries. But okay. This kind of joining together and creating regional institutions helps countries, the member countries, to strengthen their position in global negotiations. This is an important reason for all kinds of regional cooperation, which political economy people do very much enforce. And of course, today, and this is the case for the BRICS, using the US dollar more and more means that you have to follow international politics and diplomacy of the US, because the US is increasingly using the US dollar as a weapon of international politics. So if you disagree, you can't use the dollar, and it's very difficult to circumvent the dollar. But thinking in the BRICS case, you would enter into another problem if you would create a common currency of the BRICS, or join somehow with the Russian ruble, you would enter the same way under the sanctions of the US, or in a similar way. This could be something very hindering. You certainly will talk about that. Okay. But the common currency, and of course, behind the big lines, big headlines, there were discussions about creating mechanisms of using the regional currencies of the BRICS for trade, or creating a unit of account, because a common currency is good for making headlines. But a common currency, we know from the case of Europe, is something which takes ages, decades to construct. And certainly, if these countries go a similar way, they would not take the same road as the euro construction. It's a different case, but it takes time. It involves very many steps of adjustment, confidence building, etc., etc. So the European Payment Union, in that sense, can be seen as a starting point which paved the way at long term towards the euro. And the same could be for regional payment systems in sequencing, etc. Certainly different, but still one could see it as a long-term project. But I think what we can take from the SML, and with this I finish, is that it shows how much it needs to be constructed with much care and patience, and looking towards the constituency and the specific interests of the actors involved. It is, and this is the Hirschmanian concept we use in the paper, a very diminutive mechanism, but Hirschman argues that it's very important for development processes to give attention to these diminutive processes, because they shape and create institutions along opportunities and along actors, concrete actors and their interests, etc. And from there, it is possible to scale up. In theory, forgetting for 1 second delay, it would be possible to scale up the SML. There have been meetings in the Mercosur this year which prepared some ways of increasing the scale of the Mercosur, still in the same lines, but facilitating intra-regional trade. And of course, from this kind of creating the possibility of using the domestic currencies in trade with other partners instead of the US dollar can be done in a simple way first, as the SML does, but then from there it is possible to create a unit of account which would be just an artificial currency, not generally used, but used to net positions of central banks. And what could think nowadays in the link, and this maybe goes together with Christoph's presentation of central bank currencies. But the idea is, let's experiment. Don't try to jump on the big political ideas. Go along existing rationalities and do not over-politicize regional initiatives. This is what Ocampo has as a main message towards Latin America, but probably also towards BRICS integration. Thank you.
Agradecer a professora Bárbara, né? Universidade Livre de Berlim. Acho que o Bruno também vai apresentar, né, Bruno? Ou só o Felipe? Só o Felipe mesmo. Mas o trabalho também é escrito pelo professor Bruno Conti, né? E agora, então, peço gentileza para o Felipe, lembrando que ao final, não vai ser agora em seguida, ao final, o professor Bruno vai comentar os 3 trabalhos. Né? Agora peço, então, por gentileza, ao Felipe prosseguimento.
Bom, boa tarde. Me ouvem bem? Boa tarde. A apresentação, vocês estão conseguindo visualizar? Não sei se... Beleza. Bom, boa tarde para todos, todas. Primeiramente, eu quero agradecer o convite, né? O convite partiu do professor Bruno, que foi meu orientador na época do doutorado, que eu estive na Unicamp. Agradeço também a professora Carol, que coordena as atividades do seminário, o apoio do professor Fábio também. É um grande prazer voltar à casa, embora virtualmente, né, por enquanto. Uma casa que foi tão importante para a minha formação, né, então é um prazer, né, discutir aqui os trabalhos que a gente tem desenvolvido desde então. É também um prazer dividir a mesa com a Bárbara, com o Bruno, com o Christoph, especialmente Bárbara e Bruno, que são referências, né, fundamentais, aí, referências acadêmicas fundamentais para o desenvolvimento do trabalho. Eu peço licença para fazer minha exposição em português, tá? Aí eu fiz o esforço aqui de preparar a apresentação em inglês para ajudar o acompanhamento do Christoph, mas de antemão peço desculpas aí por isso. Bom, então o trabalho, né, ele se intitula Dólar e Comércio na Periferia, uma abordagem keynesiana-estruturalista e o Sistema de Pagamentos em Moeda Local, Argentina, Brasil, né, enquanto experiência. Esse trabalho, passando aqui para o próximo slide, ele é fruto, né, da própria tese de doutorado que eu desenvolvi aí na Unicamp, né, sob orientação dos professores Bruno e do Paulo Vanoide também. Então, vocês encontram no repositório, quem tiver interesse no tema. Foi defendido em 2020. Naquele período, enfim, a gente não estávamos muito animados, né, o contexto era diferente, a integração regional, o Mercosur não era, né, a agenda do momento, então eu lembro de ter defendido a tese um pouco desanimado em relação a isso, né? Mas como as coisas mudam e mudam para melhor, esse ano ele trouxe novidades, né? Então a gente vê todo o esforço, né, de resgate da reconstrução das parcerias estratégicas, né, do Brasil aí com a Argentina, com países do Mercosur, e o tema monetário né, ganhou destaque desde janeiro, a primeira visita do presidente Lula à Argentina. Então, acho que estamos num contexto aí que já possibilita, né, mais ânimo aqui para a pesquisa, eu acho que estimulou até o desenvolvimento desse trabalho aqui, a continuidade dele. Fora isso, né, após a defesa da tese, acompanhando a literatura, as publicações, o tema, né, a discussão aí da denominação do comércio, o instrumento monetário que é usado para denominar o comércio, ele também tem aparecido em publicações do FMI e do BIS, tá? Isso é bem interessante. Depois, né, eu vou aprofundar um pouco as conclusões desses trabalhos, que vão ter relação direta aqui com o tema da pesquisa, tá? E, né, fora toda a discussão, né, de novo, né, geopolítica, que a dependência do dólar pode gerar, né, tomando como exemplo aí as sanções financeiras do Ocidente contra a Rússia, né? E aí, mais recentemente, né, fomos surpreendidos com a vitória do Milei na Argentina, que coloca de novo, né, em questão, né, enfim, o que será do Mercosul e, portanto, o que será do SNE, embora eu tenda a ser mais otimista em relação a isso, tá? Avançando aqui, a gente tem que levar em conta também que, apesar desses movimentos, né, movimentos no campo da retórica, mas também no campo de mecanismos que vêm sendo criados e desenvolvidos para lidar com a dependência, né, do dólar no comércio, a gente tem que ter em conta que nenhum deles, até o momento, coloca em xeque, né, o domínio do dólar. Tá? Então, o dólar continua como divisa-chave, né, dominante. A gente pode ter movimentos bilaterais, regionais, mas isso não questiona a dominância do dólar. Tá? Daí, tendo isso em vista, os objetivos do nosso trabalho é analisar os efeitos, né, da dominância do dólar sobre o comércio na periferia. Então, a gente está olhando para o comércio que acontece, né, entre dois países periféricos, e a gente usa aqui como instrumental analítico, teórico, a abordagem da hierarquia de moedas, né, uma abordagem muito cara à casa, né, a Escola de Campinas, que parte aí das discussões keynesianas estruturalistas, e com base nisso, discutir as potencialidades e os limites do sistema de pagamentos em moeda local, como instrumento para mitigar as assimetrias monetárias. Tá? Essa parte eu não vou aprofundar tanto, porque a professora Bárbara ela, né, fez uma excelente explanação, então vai me ajudar aqui na minha discussão. Tá? Acho que eu vou conseguir explorar outras coisas e só trazer alguns elementos adicionais para a discussão do SML. Tá? Aí eu dividi a apresentação em três partes. Então, primeiro eu vou discutir um pouco o padrão de denominação do comércio internacional. A gente fala que é o padrão de invoicing, né? Então, invoicing é essa função monetária correspondente à denominação dos preços dos bens e serviços e os determinantes. Então, né, fazemos aqui uma revisão da literatura para entender quais são esses determinantes. A segunda parte, entender os efeitos na periferia. E, por fim, o SML enquanto um estudo de caso. Tá? Aqui eu apresento para vocês um esquema em que eu trago, né, aquela análise tradicional. Quando a gente pensa no uso internacional das moedas, né, é comum a gente falar nas funções, no desempenho das funções no âmbito privado, no âmbito oficial, tomando por base as contribuições pioneiras do Benjamin Cohen, né? E aí a gente consegue aplicar essa mesma análise em uma transação de comércio típica, né? Então, a gente pode visualizar o exercício das três funções, tá? Aqui a gente está observando o comércio entre dois países, o fluxo de mercadorias entre dois países. Então, no primeiro momento, né, quando há negociação entre exportador e importador, o preço é fixado em uma dada moeda, né? Então, a gente tem aqui o exercício da função unidade de conta, tá? E é aqui, nesse momento inicial da transação de comércio, que se define a chamada moeda de invoice. A literatura, né, ela aponta três possibilidades. Então, usar a moeda do exportador, né, a moeda do importador, que aparece como moeda local, e uma moeda veículo, seria uma terceira moeda, né, que não são as moedas dos países envolvidos na transação. Tá? Se puder voltar no esquema anterior, eu estou no slide anterior, por favor. Obrigado. Então, nesse primeiro momento, a gente tem a decisão de invoice, tá? Que é fundamental, porque se a gente pegar sinergias monetárias, as sinergias que envolvem, né, as funções monetárias, isso acaba determinando o uso da moeda, dessa mesma moeda de unidade de conta ao longo de toda a transação. Tá? Uma vez fixado o preço, os importadores fazem seus pedidos. Né? Nesse momento, a moeda ela serve como reserva de valor. E, por fim, né, no momento do pagamento, ela serve como meio de troca. Ao longo desse processo, esses agentes estão sujeitos às flutuações da taxa de câmbio. Os modelos de macroeconomia aberta, tradicionais, né, pautados aí para uma abordagem novo keynesiana, eles assumem rigidez de preço no curto prazo. Então, essa volatilidade cambial, ela vai afetar, seja, né, a demanda estrangeira pelos produtos, seja a receita esperada do exportador, né? Então, temos essa incerteza aí gerada. Independente, né, se o preço é determinado na moeda do produtor, ele vai sofrer, né, a incerteza em relação à demanda estrangeira pelo seu produto, tá, exportado. Próximo slide, por favor. Bom, e aí, pessoal, a primeira discussão, né, a discussão sobre os determinantes e a moeda que é usada como invoice, desponta lá nos anos 70, com as contribuições do economista sueco Sven Grassmann, tá? E aí, naquele momento, ele vai apresentar evidências, né, de que é possível afirmar que o padrão, né, de pagamentos aí do comércio internacional, ele é caracterizado por uma simetria, em que a moeda do produtor é frequentemente utilizada. Então, ele vai visualizar que 75% do comércio, né, seria aí pautado pela moeda do produtor, tá? Claro que ele já aponta, né, que os países menos desenvolvidos tendem a usar moedas de terceiro, moedas veículos, mas como eles computavam uma parcela pequena do comércio global, isso não afetava essa tendência geral, essa simetria, tá? E aí a primeira geração dos modelos, né, de economia aberta, keynesianos, aí pautados, né, nas contribuições pioneiras do Mandel e Fleming, lá nos anos 60, eles vão assumir rigidez de preço, né, no curto prazo, na moeda do produtor, na moeda do exportador, né? E isso se torna um pressuposto importante para se entender a centralidade da flexibilidade cambial no ajustamento externo, né? Então, via taxa de câmbio, né, os países eles conseguiriam se ajustar, né, simultaneamente exportações e importações, tá? Aí a questão que a gente tem que fazer é a seguinte: será que essa simetria visualizada lá atrás, ela prevaleceu, né, no período mais recente? Principalmente tomando em consideração, né, o contexto de globalização financeira e toda a centralidade do dólar, né, como instrumento aí de denominação dessa riqueza universal, e a própria criação do euro, a própria criação do euro, né, que pode ter alterado essa dinâmica monetária internacional, tá? E aí, quando a gente se volta para a literatura mais recente, né, o que a gente tem é que o uso de veículo, né, de moedas veículos, é bastante comum, né? É bastante comum. A gente tem no comércio internacional o uso de poucas moedas, principalmente o dólar a nível global, e o euro vai ter uma importância a nível regional, né? Principalmente ali dentro da Europa e parte da África, a região mais ao norte da África, tá? Então, esses trabalhos, né, mais recentes apontam evidências nesse sentido, tá? De que a simetria visualizada lá atrás, ela já não explica o padrão de denominação do comércio mundial, tá? Aí no próximo slide, o que alguns desses autores, né, vem chamando a atenção é que o modelo de precificação, ele pode ser tomado como o modelo de moeda dominante, né? Então, a gente tem o dólar cumprindo esse papel, tá? E aí, a pergunta que se faz é qual o efeito disso? A transmissão de choque entre os países, né? E o efeito disso também para o próprio mecanismo de ajuste externo. Porque um pressuposto básico lá dos primeiros modelos era que a denominação se dava na moeda do produtor, né? Mas caso não seja, né, como isso vai afetar o ajustamento externo. Então, essa discussão aparece nos textos mais recentes do FMI, né? Os textos vão se voltar para essa temática do ajustamento externo, e o BIS também pensa a questão as publicações do BIS pensam também a questão do financiamento em dólar, né? Então, se o dólar é um importante instrumento de denominação, né, parte considerável do financiamento dessas atividades é feita em dólar, né? E de que maneira, né, esse acesso ao financiamento em dólar pode afetar as condições aí do comércio, tá? Apesar, né, dessa discussão, e eles vão qualificar qual que é o papel da flexibilidade cambial, né, falando, olha, a flexibilidade cambial ela não gera, né, todos aqueles resultados favoráveis para um país, né, periférico, um país que utiliza veículos, né, enfim, os ajustes vão ser mais recessivos, né, o ajuste vai ser via queda das importações, não vai ter tanto, no curto prazo, né, não vai ter tanta influência sobre as exportações, então, eles avançam nesse sentido, tá? Porém, a análise, ela ainda fica muito presa ao nível da firma, né? Eles vão entender que a decisão de faturamento, ela depende de complementaridades estratégicas, ou seja, a empresa, o produtor, o exportador, ele vai preferir precificar na mesma moeda que os seus concorrentes no mercado mundial usam, né? E também depende da sua posição nas cadeias globais de valor, né? Então, se essa empresa precisa importar produtos, né, que são denominados em dólar, então é muito provável que ela também vai usar o dólar para denominar os preços dos bens que ela mesma exporta, né? E aí o que a gente argumenta é que essa abordagem é incompleta, porque ela ignora os constrangimentos estruturais das relações monetárias e financeiras contemporâneas, e que é uma dimensão central da relação centro-periferia. Então, a gente resgata essa visão keynesiana-estruturalista, né, de falar, olha, a gente tem aqui condicionantes estruturais que, de partida, já excluem a possibilidade dos países periféricos escolherem, né, as suas próprias moedas. Então, de partida, já é uma decisão desigual, tá? Avançando aqui, eu apresento para vocês um mapa, né? Parte do esforço desse grupo de pesquisadores do FMI foi desenvolver um banco de dados, tá? Sobre o invoicing, né? Sobre o invoicing, porque a gente não tem acesso a esses dados de uma forma fácil, né? São dados escassos, enfim. Então, eles fizeram esse esforço, é uma base de dados incompleta, né? A gente não tem informação para todos os países, mas, né, eu acredito que já é um avanço até para o desenvolvimento de estudos mais aplicados, né, sobre a temática. Aí, no próximo slide, eu peguei esses dados e montei aí, né, uma representação no mapa para a gente ver a participação do dólar nas exportações aqui para o ano de 2018, tá? Então, em cinza são países que a gente não tem informação, e aí os países, quanto mais escuros, né, esse vermelho escuro, maior o uso do dólar, tá? Percebam que o uso do dólar é dominante, né, na América, na Ásia, em boa parte do continente africano, né? E aqui só Europa e o norte da Europa que é mais claro, tendo em vista o papel exercido pelo euro, né, nessa parte do mundo, né? Então, o euro, esses trabalhos apontam, né, a importância do euro enquanto uma moeda regional, tá? Então, acho que isso mostra bem para a gente aí o domínio do dólar no comércio mundial. Pegando aqui a América do Sul, né, o Brasil, ele está mais claro aí, né, de fato, o uso do dólar contabiliza cerca de 95%, tá? E aí o argumento, né, que a gente traz, a gente tem, né, informações apontando para isso, evidências que apontam para esse elemento, é que isso, em boa parte, esse resultado tem relação com o SML, né? O SML, ele reduziu, né, embora de forma muito limitada, o uso das moedas, o uso do dólar, né, e facilitou o uso das moedas locais no Mercosur, tá? E aí isso é uma evidência de um relativo sucesso dessa política, tá? Daqui a pouco a gente vai ver alguns dados nesse sentido, tá? No próximo slide, eu trago aqui uma síntese, né, dos determinantes do padrão de invoice, o que a literatura aponta, enfim, o que está por trás da decisão dessa escolha, tá? E aí, um primeiro elemento são os custos de transação envolvidos nas operações cambiais, e aí isso favorece o uso, né, de uma moeda que participa, né, da maior parte das transações, enfim, então leva ao uso do dólar. Um segundo elemento seria as características da indústria e dos bens comercializáveis, né? Então, qual que é o grau de diferenciação do bem, né? Uma indústria mais oligopolizada, né? Ou é uma indústria, né, voltada para a produção de bens primários, commodities agrícolas e minerais, isso vai afetar, né, a escolha de invoice. E, por fim, a volatilidade macroeconômica, né? Instabilidade cambial, monetária, também é apontada como elementos aí do determinante do invoice, tá? Avançando mais um pouco, eu sintetizo aqui num quadro, tá? Quais seriam esses determinantes no nível macroeconômico, micro e no nível da transação. Então, importam o tamanho da economia, participação no comércio, né? Participação no giro cambial, o desenvolvimento dos mercados financeiros domésticos, a estrutura da indústria, a natureza das firmas, o próprio tamanho da ordem comercial, seriam elementos aí que, né, enfim, estão relacionados com a decisão de invoice, tá? Aí, passando 2 slides, se possível, por favor. O próximo, esse já foi. Isso. Aí, né, feito esse apanhado aqui da literatura, vou acelerar, estou cuidando do tempo, já vi que eu já atingi, mas já vou concluindo aqui. A ideia do artigo é justamente se apoiar na abordagem keynesiana-estruturalista, né, para dizer, olha, a gente tem determinantes estruturais dessa decisão de invoice, né, então, para além aí das discussões que focam no nível da firma, volatilidade macroeconômica, a gente tem condicionantes que, inclusive, reforçam essa volatilidade, né, reforçam a participação, né, da periferia no comércio global, no sentido de ter uma pauta exportadora mais primarizada, né? Então, a gente faz esse esforço aqui de se apoiar nessa abordagem, né, para dizer, olha, a gente tem esses elementos aqui que são fundamentais, tá? Especialmente no contexto de globalização financeira, do padrão, né, sistêmico aí de financiarização, né, e as grandes corporações do comércio inseridas nesse padrão financiarizado, né, elas vão se apoiar, né, nas moedas centrais, especialmente o dólar, tá? Então, basicamente, a gente faz esse esforço, tá? Aí, o próximo slide é um quadro que ele sintetiza os efeitos do domínio do dólar no comércio periférico, tá? Então, pensando aí o intercâmbio entre 2 países periféricos. Aqui a gente dividiu em 2 dimensões, a dimensão macroeconômica, micro, e a gente tem aqui condicionantes estruturais relacionados à globalização financeira, né, regime de câmbio flutuante, a própria financiarização, a conjuntura, muito relacionada aí ao ciclo de liquidez internacional, a política monetária dos Estados Unidos. E aí o que a gente tem em síntese, né, é que pequenos produtores são facilmente excluídos, né, dos mercados estrangeiros, né? A gente tem custos de transação elevados, alta volatilidade cambial, que pode levar a problemas de currency mismatch, problemas no financiamento, né, já que o crédito é em dólar, então, dependendo se a conjuntura não é favorável, isso pode se tornar um entrave, né? Ampliação da restrição externa, aumenta o grau, né, de repasse cambial para os preços de importação, tá? Com efeitos inflacionários redistributivos. O ajustamento externo ele se dá muito mais via medidas recessivas, e todo o problema, né, que envolve aí uma conjuntura hostil de escassez de divisas, escassez de dólar, né, ou se for uma conjuntura favorável, podemos vivenciar também uma apreciação cambial que desfavorece aí as transações correntes, tá? Por fim, avançando aqui, a discussão sobre o SML. Então, o SML é um mecanismo, né, que busca mitigar esses efeitos aqui deletérios, tá? Eles não contemplam uma reforma do sistema monetário internacional, né, e nem uma completa desdolarização. O próprio funcionamento do mecanismo, como a Bárbara explicou, né, passa pelas transferências em dólar feitas ali na compensação entre os bancos centrais, né? Então, o objetivo é, né, ser uma alternativa ao sistema de pagamentos tradicional, justamente para facilitar a participação das pequenas empresas no comércio, né? Acho que pode passar também. Aqui é mesma representação, o mesmo gráfico que a Bárbara trouxe, né? Então, não é novidade, só para mostrar para vocês que a participação do SML ainda é pequena nesse comércio bilateral, apesar de ter crescido aí ao longo do tempo, né? E ter se mantido relativamente estável. Pode passar para o próximo, por favor. E a gente pode se questionar o seguinte: o que aumenta, né, a probabilidade do uso do SML? Então, as pequenas empresas que têm uma estrutura de custos baseada na moeda local, que não tem esse padrão financiarizado, né, de gestão dos seus lucros, dos seus rendimentos, né? Empresas que mantêm subsidiárias no outro país, no seu parceiro bilateral, que assim facilita a conversão de uma moeda na outra. Então, a gente levantou essas características aí que poderiam facilitar o uso do próprio SML, né? A gente tem um problema do uso desequilibrado. Então, basicamente, são exportações brasileiras que computam, né, a maioria absoluta das transações cursadas pelo sistema, né? Mas por meio de entrevistas, né, a gente também pode observar, né, que quem, né, usa uma vez, geralmente vai usar outras vezes. Foi levantado o desconhecimento do sistema, então, apesar do sistema já existir desde 2008, né, talvez a gente tenha problemas aí de divulgação nesse sentido, né, e a gente tem que colocar também aqui a questão das inflexões políticas que podem afetar, né, o Mercosur, e a gente está vivendo aí agora uma inflexão importante, né, com a vitória do Milei na Argentina, que leva a gente a pensar aí sobre o futuro, né? Então, acho que vai muito na linha ali do que a Bárbara pontuou, de que precisamos pensar em maneiras de não politilizar, né, aqui o Mercosur e o SML, tá? Não obstante essas dificuldades, o que a gente tem é que empresas foram favorecidas, tá, com SML, e o próprio uso do real como instrumento de invoice, ele se ampliou, tá? Então, aqui tem uma informação, né, que diz que de 2007 a 2011, então, nesse começo aí da operação do SML, o uso do real saltou de 4,3 milhões para 1,3 bilhões de dólares nessa função aqui de invoice, tá? Considerando o comércio com a Argentina. Então, é um salto importante, né, que ajuda a gente até a entender por que, em comparação com os seus vizinhos sul-americanos, o Brasil ele tem uma porcentagem um pouco menor aí do domínio do dólar, tá? É uma institucionalidade muito importante, né, que nos ajuda a enfrentar a crise no futuro. Tem uma significância prática e importante no sentido, né, de coordenação macroeconômica no Mercosul, coordenação entre os bancos centrais, e pode contribuir para a emergência de uma dinâmica virtuosa em que novas medidas vão sendo progressivamente adotadas, levando a mudanças monetárias regionais que marginalmente podem afetar, né, a dinâmica monetária internacional em alguma medida. Ok? Então, é isso. Fico à disposição para as dúvidas, para as questões. Desculpem aí ter passado o tempo.
Hello, everyone. I'm sorry. I will speak the English language used for the dollar. In the morning, I actually gave a talk about the BRICS challenge or the Chinese challenge to the US dollar that would fit here. But I'm slated now for crypto, and crypto is also a way to pay across borders. So it might still fit somehow to the wonderful presentations you heard before. The politics of regulating crypto assets. By now it has become very clear that Bitcoins is not money, but an asset. I'll provide you with a few data. I was a bit astounded that there are now 25,000 different types of coins out there. That there are quite a number of exchanges, but just a few are very important. But one has been closed down. The market cap has been quite high. It's volatile. Trading volume has been also quite high, so it's much used. And though it is called decentralized finance, in the end it is pretty concentrated. There are 25,000 coins, but most of it concentrates on Bitcoins and Ethereum. That there are many owners, but there's only a small group that really owns a lot there. And then the validators who validate transactions, they join pools, so you have quite a high concentration in that decentralized business. Here you see these all-time high in recent years going down, but they are not gone. That's very clearly, they are not gone. And you see here that Bitcoin and Ethereum are the key coins in trade. Now, what is stable coins? And they are, I think, quite important also for the topic before that. I had written there so-called stable coins because they're proven not to be completely stable there. But of course, in the business language of selling something, then you use that kind of a term. And here, Ether is the dominant coin. Ether. So, who is using that platform traffic? And you see that Latin America is quite dominant in the use, but very diverse among the countries. So it's very much Venezuela there, and Argentina. Brazil is not so much in it. So what are the social bets? Very quickly, on the right hand, I have the environmental problem of the key coin, the Bitcoin, that uses the proof of work, where then computer power is used to validate a transaction. And proof of stake is where someone puts up some money, and that is less environmentally damaging there. It has been very useful for criminals. It may destabilize the financial sector because it is also leveraged. People are active in it by going into debt there. It is much, and I'll show you in the next slide, it is much used basically as a gambling tool for most people there. So it's entertainment, but entertainment can also lead to addiction and poverty for those. And it's a new form of dollarization. It is used in some countries as an alternative to the domestic currency, and thereby also an alternative to the dollar there, or in addition to the dollar there. And I think there's a great ideological effect in it that one thinks so one can get rich rather quickly there. But there are also some social goods. Things are not always so completely black and white. It allows for, conversation and so on with people, just like normal gambling. But it is also a way to secure money, if you have money, in authoritarian countries. And young Russian men made use of that, and that by going outside the country, they could take money with them if they were already familiar with IT technology and software, and so they then were also using crypto by then moving from Russia to Kazakhstan or Germany or Turkey or wherever. And the people claim there's technological progress. I personally have the feeling that it is not so much of a progress. This blockchain technology could also be developed in different ways. But I think very important that one is not overlooking that there are also some, under specific circumstances, some positive stuff. So what are my research questions? What is the relation between regulation of big banks and growth of crypto? That's actually how I started. And why do governments actually promote crypto? That also took place. Why does regulation come so late? And why the call for regulation? And these were, in a way, my key questions. And theory. I think Kindleberger explained it all, and Minsky helped it too. And so you have a financial crisis, 2007 to 2009, and people criticize the status quo of our monetary system and start a new narrative, and that's the Bitcoin narrative of doing without these powerful institutions. They're giving control to ordinary people. So there is really a new strong narrative. And then there is a sober stage there in this cycle where tech-savvy people are using it, and criminals, so, that for good. And then comes the period of low interest rates. And I tell you how much I pay for my mortgage, 0.4% in Germany for 10 years. So there is easy money flowing out, and the prospect then for capital gains. And that then really gets people in. A very typical cycle there. Then FOMO, fear of missing out. Keynes also wrote about it, and other people. Then you have the insiders and outsiders there. The insiders who are really knowledgeable about the speculative circles, and for them it's really now important to pinpoint the date where suddenly things might go in a different direction. But the outsiders are at home and are too slow to react, and then are losing out. People are then, because there is capital gains, are using leverage. And then comes a new displacement, and that is the interest rates are going up, and we have, in a way, then a crash there. This kind of a cycle, I think, is well explained by that. But there's also a bit of a political logic behind it. One could say, at Germany of finance, since starting with the end of Bretton Woods, then the need to hedge that was not so much covered in the previous talk, that of course currencies are always hedged in transborder transactions there. And hedging is a way of speculation too, so, quite naturally. So I would say there is a certain hegemony of finance that survived the big financial crisis. Then there's a halo effect of IT. Oh, that's something new, interesting. And then, of course, there's a competition for jobs. So there is, apparently that's a new field. These companies, finance, FTX and so on, are employing lots of new people with high salaries. There's possibilities for taxes. And of course, they lobby very strongly. And we do know that Bankman-Fried paid to 1/3 of Congress people in the United States. 1/3. And then now ideas about regulation. I call this the Goethe effect. That were very difficult to pronounce it for Germans, Dutch language, but it's der Hude there. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. She wrote a wonderful book about speculation and finance, and showing that by then trying to regulate finance and to separate, in a way, speculation and gambling from serious trying to do hedging, and thereby regularizing a specific activity and legitimizing it in a way. And I'll come to that. And I think that's a very interesting idea. So very briefly, that crypto is gambling also reached the higher levels of the British Empire in the UK. I don't really have to go through it. Just moving on, I would say it is also speculation there. Because first of all, also building on the Goethe's work, it is not so easy to draw a very clear line between speculation and gambling there. And for money holders in weak currencies, there is then also a use, one can also avoid government restrictions and all investments are somewhat speculative. If you build a steel mill, that's also speculation that in the end people will buy my steel. Only that cryptos, of course, are extremely volatile, and there are no dividends in a way. There are just these appreciations, the capital gains in a way. Though they expanded, and as these, on the one hand, like Bitcoin is created through a very environmentally insensitive process, but later on they are traded on a platform. And here these platforms started then also to provide possibilities for people to then lend out coins and so on, and thereby then also paying interest. So again, here the line is not quite so clear, but overall one could say mainly it is about capital gains, or the hope for capital gains. For the insiders, I would say it is really speculative investments that as a way to increase the money. For the outsiders, I would say it is basically gambling. And when one looks at surveys, it seems also that holding crypto for fun investments, it is also some entertaining activities there. That what we also see that the millions who have crypto have rather little of that. That also underlines that for many it is really more an issue of gambling there. while some of them also gamble with high amounts of money there. And here one sees for what it is then used when the coins are on the platforms there. And a lot has been, before the crash, then lending there. That has been an activity, trading, day trading in a way. The derivatives and stuff like that, that was not so important there. And you see the big crash here. And now the next slide will show that not everything crashed so much. Oops. Boom. Well, where's my other one? Somehow lost. It comes later. Sorry, I forgot. The stable, but I can already say now here, the stable coins, they didn't crash so much there. And that's interesting for cross-border transactions there. Okay, moving to this issue of regulation there. As I already mentioned, the financial crisis delegitimated the central banks a bit at the time, and Bitcoin started. Dodd-Frank then tried to regulate the banking system, and but the focus was really on banks and not so much on private equity, hedge funds, and so on. So that was already the speculative aspect was actually left out. It was only kind of moved out of the main banking system or limited in the main banking system. But the low interest environment then incentivized the research for new asset classes. And we have seen it went into commodities, copper and so forth, land, even into agricultural commodities at the time. And so it, in a way, took a bit of time. So not immediately became mainstream, but then step by step, it became mainstream. This German guy, Mr. Thiel, who was the founder also of PayPal, and Mr. Musk was also part of that, and is also nowadays a right-wing guy. He gave then money for Ethereum there. And so a big-time investor then gave legitimacy to it. Arizona then changed the law and made it possible to have specific contracts that fit the Ethereum world. The European Union then had a blockchain observatory and forum, in a way also fear of missing out on new technology there. Then the mayor of Miami then had a Miami coin, came also into that area and here very important, Visa and PayPal then allowed crypto payments. That was then a major step in 2021. Then the big Wall Street companies followed, and BlackRock as an asset manager. Sunak was also, as a treasurer, quite open to it. And that's what got me into it. And Simone and Ana Rosa know that we did a book on public banks, and we kind of like public banks. And when I saw that the German public banks would try to make it possible for their customers to enter this world, then I got noticed. I had about 10 years at the very early stage of Bitcoin. I had a PhD student who was working for and still works for the Austrian Central Bank, then really showing very, very nicely that Bitcoin is not money, that it is an asset. And after that, I didn't really pay attention to it much there. But then that got me started, and that's also part of the public banking system in Germany. So that's kind of this mainstreaming. And as it became mainstreamed, the links to the normal financial system became stronger. the leveraged trading, very high, up to 125. That's really leverage. Then very pro-cyclical that. And also the hedge funds moved in there. And now the stable coins, and that's very important. The stable coins claim that they have, in a way, one-to-one real assets behind it. Mainly then treasury bonds, US treasury bonds, or commercial papers. But Tether has so much that it becomes really significant for the system, the seventh largest holder globally. And then Basel Committee, the committee of the central banks of the world, they then started to raise a flag that banks' exposure to crypto assets are currently limited. So they were saying, well, that we have to pay attention, but it's still limited there. But there may be potential concerns, and those we learned in the early summer when the medium-sized banks in California went under. And they were key partners of the cryptocurrency exchanges. So there are now quite clear links between the crypto world and the financial system. And that then leads to the issue of regulation there. The Chicago, now I forgot, Chicago, not now. It is the organization that looks into the derivative trades in the commodity markets. So they're in Chicago. They were then the ones who started to say, well, perhaps we should regulate, but they did that at a very low level. It was then under Biden that he was saying, well, we need to have a real plan now. We have to think in a more comprehensive way however, as I already mentioned, US Congress lived also off the Bitcoin wealth. And the key guy in the Financial Services Committee received major donations from crypto. But in the SEC, the Gensler and those people, they got very skeptical, and they then started to look more closely into it and saying, we need to have a better regulation, and it also would fit under our supervision because these are assets there. And then we have this year a lot of action. We have a shutdown of one of the stable coins, and just this month, then the conviction of a key person in the field of the platforms, and yesterday, a huge fine for Binance. So things are moving now slowly. At the global level, we have a financial action task force that then was focusing more on the money laundering aspect, that coins can be used for money laundering. And what the focus was really more on the criminal edge of it, less on the speculative edge of it. And this financial action task force then improved upon its anti-money laundering guidance and is trying to have a general approach for all countries in doing that. The EU then implemented this anti-money laundering also towards the crypto exchange platforms there. And it then started to develop a set of rules for crypto assets markets. That is then the platforms, not about the creation of a Bitcoin, but then the trading of the Bitcoin, but it took quite a time until the European Council actually adopted it, the markets in crypto assets, which is a regulation that legitimizes the crypto, but tries to separate the things that might be dangerous to the whole system there. Then the International Organization of Securities Commissions developed a standard. The Financial Stability Board got into it, and in September then they produced basically for the G20 a synthesis paper there, policies for crypto assets, and the general gist of it is if it's the same activity, the same risk, then there should be also the same regulation. And so there is now a push in a way from that area to regulate across jurisdictions, across countries. And that is taken from this synthesis paper, the kind of policy responses they want to see there. And it is really not doing away with it. It is not the Chinese strategy of outlawing the use. It is the way of seeing it as just another asset class that is traded, and one needs to have the same rules as for the other asset classes. That's the basic message here. So, relation in bank regulation, crypto, I would say that the regulation of the banks through Dodd-Frank were not so important to really launch then crypto into the mainstream. I think in the end it was more the low interest rates there. The governments promote it because it does fit somehow also into the general neoliberal framework, the tech mystique, and of course the competition for these kind of organizations where perhaps the organization doesn't pay taxes, but the employees pay taxes. And then of course the lobbying there. But not all are promoting it there. The regulation, and that is coming back to the Goethe there, it is in a way giving real support for it by then making this differentiation of something irrational, speculative, gambling type there, and legitimate kind of investment activities as one has in other asset classes. Thanks for listening.